to the young people out here, one of my favorite moderators and somebody I grew up watching every day on national television. While most of her peers were actually pursuing B school, she was there at the Kargil War reporting from ground zero. She's somebody who represented we the people for 21 long years on national television. And because the buck stops here, let me invite somebody who's been to hell and back in these last 21 years. None other than the acclaimed journalist, activist, political commentator, and now author, Barkha Dutt. Barkha, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and I hope the line remains long enough for us to actually be able to have a conversation. Thank you for having me and for the very sweet introduction.
Well, and thank you for doing this for the next generation. It's Gen Z and Gen Alpha, as I keep saying, that are our best hope. And therefore, it's people like you who inspire. The name of the series, as it says, is Parul University presents I.I.M.U.N's role models, where we try to inspire tomorrow's leaders today. And as somebody who's inspired many people, let me ask you this at the very outset, saying, you know, when I grew up, we had icons such as Rahul Dravid and Kumar Birla. I grew up in a generation which was very different from that of today, where sensationalism was less and where content was more. Things are obviously very different. But before we get into that, who was your role model? The series is called Role Models. So who was your role model growing up?
Boring answer, but my role model was my mother, who actually died when I was 13 years old. And the reason that she was my role model is because she was even more rebellious than I am. And she was, you know, when she applied to be a journalist at the Hindustan Times, there was no television, no internet then, old-fashioned newspapers. She was told that women can't, you know, we don't hire women to be journalists. If we hire women, you know, you can go and cover the neighborhood flower show. That's what women reporters are meant for. And before I covered the Kargil War in 1999, in 1965, when there was a war between India and Pakistan, she went to her bosses and said, I want to cover this war. And they said to her, like was said to me 3 decades later, you're a woman, you can't go to the war front. So she said, well, look, if you're not going to let me cover the biggest story there is, then mujhe chutti pe jaane do. So she took chutti, but she went alone with a notepad and pen. She had a cousin in the army and she went alone to the war front. So many people think I was the first woman war correspondent of India, but actually it was my mother, Barkha Dutt. And so I think she's my role model, and she got to do, apart from all the great things she did, hard news, she also got to interview the Beatles, and I have a photograph of her on my wall where she's sitting squished between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and I'm like, wow. I have serious envy looking at that photo. So yeah, she's my role model.
No, mothers are an inspiration at home, and in your case, they were inspiration both at home and outside home as well for the many things that she's done. This is really eye-opening. The fact that, you know, she was the first war journalist. That's something that I'm sure a lot of young people wouldn't have necessarily known. But coming back to the contentious topic, that a lot of things have changed. I remember listening to the Prime Minister, who would rarely speak, but when he would speak, he would make a lot of sense. I remember listening to an erudite Karan Thapar asking the difficult questions on TV. And now all of a sudden, sensationalism seems to have taken over your field, which is the fourth pillar of democracy. Suddenly it's all about TRPs and it's less about content. As an author and also as a journalist, do you sometimes worry saying that this has become too much? Or is it just a few channels and yet there are the vast majority that are reporting news in the correct manner? Because it's very difficult for somebody like me who saw some anchors on TV suddenly change now, and where TV is suddenly something that we don't necessarily go to for a daily cup of news. So is this something that you resonate with?
Yeah, why do you think so many of us of a certain time in TV news left television? Look, I loved TV as a medium per se. I'm a child of television, a first generation broadcast journalist, trained in the visual medium. But what started happening to TV, at its best, it became dull, talking head driven. At its worst, it's a bunch of hate mongers. So, you know, if the best is banal and the worst is hate mongering, I think that it was time to basically carve one's own path. And I can see many of my colleagues have tried to do that in the digital space, which anyway is the medium of the present, is the medium of the future, which anyway is how more and more people your age and even my age consume our content. Secondly, look no further. We have our country having to apologize, our envoy summoned by 15 nations because of a anti-Islamic comment made on a primetime TV show, where actually it's par for the course for this kind of tutu meme, for this kind of vitriol, for this kind of toxicity to be spewed. And these channels and these presenters who have presented themselves as the hyper-nationalist voices of the country have in fact today proved that they are worthy of that phrase they like to use for others, anti-national, because they've actually put the entire country in such an embarrassing position because of the kind of rubbish that is allowed on these programs. So does it resonate that TV is a diminishing, at least in India, the way TV has evolved is depressing. It makes me angry. It makes me sad. We had 2 years of the pandemic. In the first wave, you barely had television put boots on the ground. It was left to independent digital journalists, local reporters in small towns, the regional press, to actually cover the biggest story that we're going to see in our lifetime. That said, the TRP is all of us. It's all of you. You have the power, we have the power to reject the content that we don't accept. And everywhere I go, people crib about TV news, but people do not exercise their veto right. And that veto right is very simple to exercise. It's called using the remote and just not switching on or amplifying what you think is toxic and poisonous.
But like you said, using the veto right is something that one doesn't exercise often. The UN, of course, seems to be exercising, people in the UN the countries in the UN seem to be exercising that far too often. But the rise of fervent nationalism, of course, is a global phenomenon. But that said, that the fact that we are all Indian at the end of the day, and sometimes I talk to some people across political lines and they say that, there's nothing that we have against the likes of a Karan Thapar or a Barkha Dutt, or for the matter of Veer Das. And I see sometimes some reason in their arguments in the fact when they mention that why malign? And this is a lot of young people resonate with what they say, and which is why I'm asking you this question, saying why malign the reputation of a country in articles in the Washington Post or the Hindustan Times, and the Hindustan Times yet fine because it's an Indian newspaper, but on international platforms and pedestals, vis-a-vis seek reform in your own country. This is what a lot of people who are your detractors put up as argument, saying if they really want to make a difference, why wouldn't they want to change the system as it existed in our country in comparison to rake up all of this controversy in Western democracies?
So I'm a ferociously proud Indian. In fact, I don't share a lot of new age notions that the world is a global village. We are all citizens of the world. I am extremely proud Indian. I cut my teeth covering the military. I have great love for the institutions of the Indian state. But I don't think politicians are the Indian state. That's the first point. Secondly, if you really care about how the world is looking at you, you should care much more about the things that are happening that are embarrassing India and not the people who are reporting them. Lastly, we live in an interconnected universe. You and I have no idea what city. Where are you right now? You could be in Washington for all I know. Where are you?
I'm in Bombay. I'm in Mumbai.
You're in Bombay. Yeah, but you could be in Washington, right? The point I'm trying to make is that the digitization of our universes has made this argument somewhat hollow, the idea of the foreign space and the idea of the domestic space. As long as I am saying precisely what I believe, and I'm not tailoring what I want to say for the benefit of a Western audience, I think that I am platform agnostic, because I don't even think before you click on a link, you stop to check, is this Indian? Is this, European? Is this British? You just click. You click because something in it appeals to you or makes you curious. And I think these are facile things, right? I believe that the left or the extreme left makes a mistake in not recognizing that majority of Indians are extremely sentimental about our country, about our state, about our flag, about our military. And I am all of those things too. I call out Western hypocrisy all of the time. However, I've never been censored been instructed on what to write in the Washington Post when I do write. I write as an Indian. I write, in fact, I think it's actually good that an Indian perspective is getting out to a global audience. Isn't that what we want?
No, of course, an Indian perspective on a global audience is necessary. But then again, just to ask you this, wouldn't it be more prudent in order to put up an international front, like you said, with what's going on in the Middle East and with the OIC and things like that? When there are negative articles and negative press that comes across for India overseas, what does happen is, good, bad or ugly, the little soft power that we are exercising overseas is somehow getting damaged. So don't you think that on an international pedestal, it should be a little more unified and a little less divisive? Just to prod one last time before we move on to the next subject.
No, I mean, if we were at war and these were our soldiers at the front line and we were asking for a unified response, yes. But if you're going to tell me that we should be less concerned that a national spokesperson or somebody else made a hateful speech, and that isn't embarrassing India, but my writing about it in the Washington Post, it's not the action, it's the reporting that's actually hurting India, then I'm going to say that's like a load of crap.
Right. This is a debate between two political parties and political ideologies, and also the way that they perceive democracy.
And I think most Indians, I actually think most Indians, for however polarized we may be, I think most Indians do not conform to the extremities of these ideologies or of these political parties. I think most Indians are extremely commonsensical, are able to tell right from wrong, are able to sort of stand up for the country when needed, and are able to, like patriotic Indians, call out what's wrong when it needs to be called out. In fact, I think if you don't call it out, you're anti-national. I think, in fact, if you do something to embarrass your country, you're anti-national. If that phrase must be used, it's a pretty banal phrase that should be used extremely sparingly.
And there is the ferocious journalist that we all know, but and the voice that is not dimmed both in India and internationally as well. But because you're somebody who's so candid, I can actually risk asking you this question, saying that, coming back to the series that is Role Models, when people talk about role models, especially with the age of instant gratification and increasing fissiparous tendencies, people rarely talk about failures. People are only focusing on successes. Has there been a failure in your life that has shaped you and made you who you are?
I think I would identify my failure to be to not have left TV earlier. I would say, and I write this in my book, my recently published book called To Hell and Back, Humans of COVID, which is based on my 2 years of travels through India, a lot of it by road, covering 30,000 kilometers, 14 states, 120 days on the road. I realized while doing that reporting and writing the book subsequently that my failure had been that I was too comfortable, I had become stale, and I didn't have the courage to leave earlier. I should have walked out a lot earlier. I should have done my own thing a lot earlier. I also count it as a failing that I lost touch with why I became a journalist. I became a journalist to be a reporter in the field. Yes, there's a skill to presenting shows and hosting them and doing good interviews, and I do all of that. But my first love is to be a reporter. My first love is the process of discovery that journalism affords you. My first love is how reporting takes you out of your comfort zone into zones that don't make you comfortable, how it challenges your assumptions, how it makes you engage with people you don't necessarily like or agree with or knew nothing about. And I had lost touch with that. Everything had become too easy. I was sitting on a peak waiting for myself to plateau out, and I probably had started plateauing out. So my failure was that I did not show the gumption to leave much earlier and reimagine myself. I'm glad I finally did it, but I think it was a failing to not have done it earlier.
Right, and you mentioned that this is something that you should have done much earlier. And in the 2 years that you have documented and written this book, you've also documented a lot of real life heroes, and that's what journalism is all about. Like you said, it's about going to the people and asking the people for their stories. Can you tell us a little more about some of these stories? And because I'm sure that they make for exciting role models. The ones that you've actually interviewed, these are the real people that should be celebrated. Can you tell us about a couple of stories that you've actually written about in the book?
Yeah, a lot of people, initially when I talk about the book, they're like, oh, we don't really want to remember COVID because it'll make us sad. And I always say that the book I've written is actually a book about all of us. I always say that we will see shades of our own life in it. It's a book about our country. It's a book about all that is flawed about us, but also a book about all that's great about us. Because as they say about our country, what you say and its opposite is always true for India. And that is what I kind of discovered through this journey. So while there was a lot of sadness and a lot of things that didn't work in the last 2 years, they were extraordinary stories of compassion and courage. And I'll share just a couple. People always tend to say, "Hum kya kar sakte hain? System hi aisa hai." But actually,
Sure.
change is always led by the power of one. So let's give you the example of a district collector called Rajinder Bharut, who is a collector in Maharashtra in a tribal district, and Nandurbar, and he is both an IAS officer and a doctor by training, but he grew up in a hut. His mother was an illiterate Adivasi woman, and he really came up from nothing. And between the first wave and the second wave, he was the only district in India, maybe because he was a trained doctor and not only a bureaucrat, who actually had the foresight to see that the second wave was coming and that oxygen could run short. So he spent his allocated budget of, he had 1 crore allocated. He spent 83 lakhs of it to build 2 liquid oxygen plants. And his district was one of the few in the country that did not run short of oxygen. And so he was able to, with that one decision, save, multiple lives. That's one example. The other example I met is of Abdul, whom I like to share his story, is Abdul Malbari, who lives in Surat. And he runs a little trust called the Ekta Manch. And, when I went to report on him, he has a hole in the wall, like office that is the size of my closet. And there was an ambulance standing in front of it. And that ambulance had a line on it saying, funerals for lonely humans, funerals for lonely humans. So basically, he's taken it upon himself that whoever doesn't have someone to perform their last rites, he will go and either cremate or bury them, irrespective of religion. And in COVID, we had a lot of bodies actually being abandoned. People were scared. There was a lot of stigma. There was a lot of paranoia. So even if people were leaving their family members, just either sometimes dumping them into rivers, sometimes leaving them outside hospitals on the road. And Mr. Malbari would actually go and make sure that nobody died alone, nobody died lonely. And in his office, he had the Ganga Jal, to perform the last rites of Hindus, and the sort of rosary and the namaz mat to perform the last rites for Muslims. And I just thought that was incredible, because this was a time when our television channels even then were trying to create divisions on the basis of religion, even during the pandemic. But in real life, you had extraordinary people like Abdul Malbari. And so there are plenty of heroes in our country, right? And that's why I think we pay too much attention to the shit that goes on social media and the poison that we have to deal with there. Because real life is very different.
Real life is very different, and Abdul Malbari and a lot of people that you've written about in your book are the real life heroes that hopefully television channels should talk about, and media channels should talk about. But then again, like you said, the power of veto yet rests with the viewer, and in this case, the power of making a difference also rests with one. But unfortunately, the state and the system dictates what needs to happen. Like, for example, the COVID cases are rising once again in the country. Okay? And the issue is that, as somebody who's seen a lot of loss personally, and I'm very sorry about that, but because of COVID, don't you think that it should be taken any differently from what it is currently? Because is it now treated like a flu? Or do you think that the worst is behind us? Is there a beginning to the end for COVID?
Right. So let me put it to you like this. I think we, as a country, learned from every wave to not repeat some mistakes, and we repeated some mistakes, right? So, for example, we made a huge amount of noise about the Tablighi Jamaat in the first wave, the mass congregation in Delhi's Nizamuddin area. And it was correct to say that a mass congregation was wrong. But then in the second wave, we were still having mass congregations, whether as melas or other religious gatherings. And then we were having election rallies. And we were forcibly sending government school employees in Uttar Pradesh on election duty. They had no agency to say yes or no. So that was a mistake we repeated. A mistake that we learned from was that the national lockdown was a humanitarian disaster. A one-size-fits-all lockdown, shutting down public transport was a humanitarian disaster. We had 100 million migrant workers displaced by what happened in the 3 weeks of that lockdown. So we learned, and we didn't make that mistake. By the time the third wave came, we realized that it was a mistake to be giving steroids for no reason. I was given them for no reason. You know, it was just a panicky reaction, and it created multiple other medical problems. We made poor people sell property to buy remdesivir, which now there's a question mark over whether it works at all. All that said, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what the new variant or a new variant might look like. It has to go variant to variant. But I'm not an advocate of lockdowns. I'm not an advocate of the China kind of zero COVID theory. There's never going to be zero COVID. What we should be focused on is hospitalizations and deaths and vaccinations. And as long as the vaccine numbers are rising and the hospitalizations are at a manageable level, we're okay. The moment there's an increase in hospitalizations, our alarm bells should go off.
So the cue should be that as soon as the numbers increase in terms of decreasing hospital beds, then we should pay much more attention to what's happening with the new variant.
I'm saying the case positivity. So just to explain the science of it, the more COVID cases there are, the more mutations there can be. So there can be a new variant that is just born from the volume of cases. So I'm not saying the volume of cases is irrelevant. It's not. At the same time, the world cannot shut down again and again and again and again and again. And as the poor said as they walked 1,000 kilometers home sometimes, the poverty will kill us before the virus will. So we cannot afford to go down the route of shutting down economic activity. But we have to be vigilant about, when we look at the dashboard, we can't look at absolute numbers. We have to look at, deaths and hospitalizations. And we were wrong in delaying the boosters. I'm glad the boosters are now here for anybody who wants them. And we've just got to keep focused on the vaccines. I think a lot has improved from the last 2 years, and let's hope it stays that way.
And let's hope it stays that way. And hope is the one thing that people thrive on and survive on. And before this conversation becomes very serious, let me end this with one final question that I have, which I've taken from somebody who usually inspires me, who usually is doing more entertainment and less serious talk, but somebody who has played a big role in my personal life and so also that of I.I.M.U.N. He does the show called Coffee with, but in this case, I'm just going to quickly ask you, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the following words? When I say India, what's the first thought that comes to your mind?
Diverse.
When I say to hell and back, humans of COVID, what's the first thought that comes to your mind?
Hope and heartbreak.
I say TRP.
The demise of television.
Youth.
Freshness.
And when I say I.I.M.U.N, that's the platform that you're on, what's the first thought that comes to your mind?
Talented, funny, engaging.
Talented. You're very, very kind, and you are very sweet. And I know that you run a busier schedule than what you were when you were on national television. But it's difficult to choose the right role model, because either the role models are absolutely right or absolutely left. In a world where
I think we need role models who are free thinkers. You know, that doesn't mean you don't believe in anything, but it means that you pick the issues that you believe in, and you don't have to be in this camp or that camp. You're yourself. I think too few people are themselves.
And to somebody who's made her own camp and is not a part of one or the other, I'm very grateful that you were able to join us today. My grandfather often used to tell me this, saying, it's better to have a conversation with a knowledgeable person than reading 100 books. But if you haven't read hers, I strongly advise that you must. It's a book worth reading and worth your time. Thank you very much, Barkha, for joining in.
Thank you. Thanks you. Thanks for having me. Take care.